Hello there! Let's now put some of the stuff we've been talking about into practice by going back to our project and convert all our pixel units to RAM. And I'll explain you why, of course. So in this lecture, you're going to learn how and why we use RAM units in our project, and why you should do the same. And of course, a workflow to convert pixels to RAM in the easiest way. So this is what we're going to do in this lecture. We will change all the absolute pixel units to relative RAM units, okay? And why are we going to do that? Well, it's quite simple actually. It's because we want an easy way to change all the measurements on our page with one simple setting. For example, when we hit a breakpoint to display our page on a mobile device. When that happens, we want a way to decrease all the measurements in our site at the same time. And instead of writing hundreds of lines of code in the media queries, we can just change one global setting, and that is the global font size. So let me show you how this awesome technique works. So you remember how the RAM unit is always in relation to the root font size, right? So if we now set that root font size, we can then very easily change all the other measurements on our page to RAM. So let's do that. So the root font size is set in the HTML selector, okay? And so we say font size 10 pixels. Not the 16 that we had before, but 10. I'm actually going to remove this one, but just commenting it out so it stays here for you to see. And so yeah, so I changed this to 10 pixels. But now, why did I change it to 10 pixels? Well, we do 10 pixels here in order to make our life easier, to be honest. That's because now we know that 1 RAM equals exactly 10 pixels, right? Because remember, 1 RAM is exactly the root font size. So if 10 pixels is now the root font size, then 1 RAM is 10 pixels. And so now it's really easy to replace all the pixel units with RAM. Because all we have to do is to divide all the pixels by 10, and that's our RAM, right? Now if it was 1 RAM is 16 pixels, then we would have to make a lot of calculations. And we don't want to do that, of course. So this is a pretty common technique to avoid that, okay? So with this in mind, let's actually do that. So we start here at the top and change all, or let's say most, of our pixel measurements to RAM. So we have a 30 pixel padding. So just divide it by 10 and you end up with 3 RAM. Okay, and that's it. So let's keep looking. What do we have here? Oh, another one, 40 pixels. So it's 4 RAM, right? So you don't have to do any calculations. You just divide it by 10. 4 RAM. And here, 3.5 RAM. Right? It makes sense, right? And I will actually show you the effect of this in a second, okay? So here we have percentages, nothing changes. Here, 6 RAM. Here again, 6 RAM. And here, 3.5 RAM. Font size here should be 2 RAM. Here it's 1.74 RAM. Well, that's a bit specific. Let's just keep it at 1.7 RAM, okay? Or we can say 1.75 RAM. Okay, that looks acceptable. Now here we have minus 10 RAM. Here just 1. And 10. And minus 1. Okay, so ideally, of course, you start by doing this right in the beginning of the project. But I didn't want to overwhelm you and to scare you with all too much theory right at the beginning of the course. And so we just started the simple way, and the way you probably already know how to do everything, which is in simple pixels. But if you're doing responsive design and modern CSS development, then it's really good practice to use relative units like RAM. So here we have 3 RAM. Now, of course, we could also have used EMs instead of RAMs, but that's a whole lot of work. Believe me, I've tried it, and it's really difficult to make. Because remember that the EMs depend not on the root font size, but on the font size of the parent element. And with that, you have to do a lot of calculations, and it becomes really difficult to manage. So I always set everything to RAM, and then it's really the best solution. 1.5 RAM, 4 RAM, and 10 RAM, of course. Here, we can also do it here in these box shadows. Here, it's 0.5. So whenever you have a point, you don't write out the 0 in CSS, okay? So it's, of course you can, it works, but it's a, like, let's say a coding practice to only put the dot, okay? It's just a good practice that professionals use. So 10 rem in here. Any more pixels? That's it. All right, so let's now take a look and see if everything is still working the same. All right, great. The only thing is here, the text size here, because originally we set it to 16 pixels, right? And so now here we actually have to set the font size. Well, yeah, here it is. So if we still want it at 16 pixels, then it should be really easy, right? So 16 pixels is 1.6 rem. So let's go back. And here we go. Great. Now what I want to show you is this. So if we now go ahead and just change the overall font size, so yeah, here it is, then see how the entire design changes. So I go down to 9, and you see that everything changes, everything became smaller. Take a look at the padding here outside, at this padding, and here at this size, and also the text size, as I will decrease it further. Sorry, this was increasing, so I decrease it further now. So everything is becoming smaller, right? And that is amazing once we start writing media queries. It will make our lives so much easier. So imagine we had now this smaller version like on a phone, and then this would already take a lot of work from us. Instead of writing all the media queries to make all the font sizes smaller and to make all of these distances here smaller, like these 30 pixels, this now automatically converts to something else. For example, in this, well, this is now really small. Let me check this. Where is it? This body. It has now a padding not of 30 pixels, but of 15 here, as you can see down here. You see, now it's 15 pixels and not the 30 that it was before. And that's because we set the font size here to 5. Right? So 5 is half of 10, and so 15 is half of 30. Right? If we put it back like to 8, then the padding becomes 24, and so forth, and so on. And the same would, of course, work in the other direction. So imagine we have a really huge screen or something, and we want to increase our design. Or someone zooms in the page, then that's what happens. So we can also write media queries for larger screens and then increase the design. All right, so that is the trick and the huge advantage of using rem. Now we can still improve this because it's actually a very bad practice to set the font size to pixels as well. So up here, this shouldn't really be 10 pixels. It should be something else. The problem is that by doing so, we actually override the browser font size setting that the user can manually change in the settings. And many people actually do that. For example, when they have bad sight and cannot see so good, then some people actually increase the default font size of their browser. Now, if we set the font to like the 10 pixels like we did here, then we remove the ability for these people to see our website properly, because they can no longer change the default font size. Well, they can, but our root font size will not be affected by that anymore. It will just be 10 pixels no matter what the user has as a default font size. So this is really a bad practice. And that is why we're going to set the overall font size to a percentage here, which will translate to a percentage of the font size given by the browser. Now, the default font size, if the user doesn't change anything, which is the initial situation that we want, is 16 pixels. So that's the absolute default. And that's the situation that we're counting on here. So if we put 100% here, this would mean that the root font size would be 16 pixels if the user doesn't change anything. And if the user does change the default font size, let's say to 18 pixels, then the root font size would be 18 pixels. If he changes to 20 pixels, then it would be 20, and so on and so forth. Now, but we don't want 16 pixels here, right? What we want is 10 pixels. And so it's very simple. All we have to do is to divide what we want, which is 10, by 16. So I'm having a calculator here. So 10 divided by 16 is 62.5%. And that is what we're putting here. 62.5%. 5%. And that's it. That's the whole technique. So now imagine, let's say 0.625. So if the default is 16 like we had before, then this translates to 10 pixels, right? Which is what we want. But if the user changes to, let's say, 20 pixels, then our default font size will be 12.5 pixels. So the root font size, I was saying. And if the user does 22, it goes to 1375 pixels, and so on and so forth. And so with this, we allow the user to actually zoom in on the page automatically, not only to change the font size, but to also zoom in on the page, because basically that's what happens. Not exactly zooming, but increasing all of the measurements that we have on our page. So make sure that you understand this technique. It's really widely used in the CSS developer community because it's so simple and yet so powerful, as you saw. Now, one thing that I should probably tell you is that RAMs are not supported below Internet Explorer 9, okay? So if you have to develop a site for one of these browsers, so the really old Internet Explorers, then you cannot use RAMs because your site will simply not work at all, okay? Now, since that applies to almost everything that I'm going to show you in this course, I guess that's not really relevant at all. Because if you're interested in taking this modern course that you're taking right now, then you're probably not trying to develop for these old browsers anyway, right? Alright, and one more thing we can do before we finish this lecture is to use the power of inheritance, since we already talked about inheritance, right? So whenever we can use inheritance, we should use it instead of using here something like the universal selector, okay? And so what I'm going to do now is to remove this box sizing from here and put it here on the body. Okay, so now we set the body to box sizing border box, and then in here what we do is to say box sizing, and we use the inherit keyword. And that's it. So remember how we could use the inherit keyword to force inheritance. That's what we're doing here. So the box sizing property by itself is not inherited, but by setting the box sizing property on each and every element on the entire page to inherit, it will automatically inherit whatever we put here on border box. So this is considered a slightly better practice by the CSS community, because it makes it a bit easier to change the box sizing, like in plugins or other components, where we might want to use a different property for box sizing. Okay, so it doesn't make a huge difference, it's just a slightly better practice to do the box sizing border box like this. Alright, and since we're at it, we should actually update this universal reset here, because we can do slightly better than this, which is to also select all of the after pseudo elements and also all of the before pseudo elements. That's because right now only the real elements get this behavior here, but the after and before pseudo elements, they don't get this behavior. And since we don't want to see any strange behavior happening, we will also include these ones here as well. So, you know, we already have a after pseudo element down here, and if we had put a width or a height and then a padding or a border, then it wouldn't have behaved the way we expected it, which we expected because of the box sizing of border box. So actually it's down here. So it wouldn't have worked the way we expected because we actually didn't have this part here in the universal selector in our global reset. Okay, so just another slightly improvement over our previous code. Okay, and that's really it for this lecture. See you in the next video.